In this video, we're testing 100 years of footballing tactics. And for each tactic, we're going to be simulating one season using that tactic with Brighton. And the reason we're using Brighton is because in this updated database, they are predicted to finish 10th in the Premier League. So they're not too good to where they can make kind of any tactic look good, but they're not so bad where any tactic is going to be bad with them. So this should give us a good indication of how well the tactic might actually work. So let's go back 100 years to the 1920s. The first great tactic was the 2-3-5. The tactic had two central defenders, three halfbacks, known today as defensive mids, and five attackers. This created a pyramid shape to the formation, so it became known popularly as the inverted pyramid. And the tactic reached great success with the Uruguayan sides of the 1920s and 1930s, who deployed it to win the first ever World Cup. So our first tactic is the inverted pyramid, or 2-3-5. And as we mentioned, it has two central defenders, three defensive mids, and five attacking players. Honestly, there's not a whole lot of information for how this tactic might be able to work in FM24, especially given that the tactic was so long ago and the game was played very differently back then. These five players here will be primarily responsible for all the defensive duties of the team, and the center halfback here is going to have an important role in being able to connect these defensive players with these attacking players, so turning defense into attack. Otherwise, these three attacking players are playing very high up the pitch, and we have two wingers who are intended to stay high and wide. I imagine you could also try to make this work with a deep lying forward here and a deep lying forward here, who could come in and sit in these areas and try to connect a little bit in this region of the field. But for now, we're going to deploy it like this, as I think this might have been how it was played back in the day. For instructions, we're going with a positive mentality. We're definitely going more direct, fairly wide, and a higher tempo. We are going to have them counter and counter press in the hopes of winning the ball higher up the pitch, given what this tactic looks like, and we're going to employ a little bit of a higher line to try and help the team win the ball higher up the pitch. So that is our 1920s tactic. How is it going to do? Unsurprisingly, not so well. Brighton have finished in last place with 25 points from 38 matches, 7 wins, 4 draws, 27 losses. Even though they finished in last place, it actually performed a lot better than I thought it would. Amazingly, first match of the season was a 4-1 victory over Bournemouth away. And they did get to, surprisingly, the Carabao Cup quarterfinal, only lost on pens to Arsenal. Otherwise, definitely a lot of losses, but honestly, more wins than I expected. It definitely performed better than I thought it would. Interestingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the formation, very high scoring tactic. Brighton were one of the top scorers in the league with 71 goals, but it also allowed 131 goals. Looking at the expected goals for the season, though, something really interesting. Brighton actually had the highest expected goals of any club in the Prem. Expected goals against, though, was also the highest in the league, so it was absolutely feast or famine. I guess more feast on both sides of the ball. And this isn't really surprising when you look at the tactic. You obviously have three forward players who, if you can get it out to the wingers, there's going to be a lot of players in the box to try and win it and score a lot of goals. A lot of players trying to get in behind as well. But definitely not enough people defensively in good positions and not enough players on the wings. I can imagine that they were overwhelmed on the wings, and that's probably how they allowed a lot of goals. But that's the 1920s. Let's move on forward. Now let's move forward to the 1960s, where a new, more conservative tactic was revolutionizing football, catenaccio. Perhaps the most famous catenaccio side was Elenio Herrera's Inter Milan, whose left back, Paquetti, was their most important player. He was an early complete wingback with the rest of the side playing around him. The winger would tuck inside, the left center back would push higher to stop attacks down the left-hand side, the right center back would cover behind, and the right back would tuck in, then the right winger would drop in more defensively. Herrera would go on to say that no one could ever emulate his success at Inter. He stated, that most people who copied him wrongly. He had Gianchito Facchetti, the first fullback to score as many goals as a forward. This is a tactic that I think will definitely work worse in game than it would in real life. I think this is one of those tactics that it's just so hard to get a defensive tactic to work in Football Manager. I think this is going to suffer from that, but I do think this is something that would work better in real life than in game. So let's talk about the tactic. A lot of that Inter Milan tactic was, again, built around the left back. So we've got our left back as a complete wing back on attack, trying to get forward, trying to bomb forward, create chances. And we have players compensating for that. So we have our central defender. He has moved over a little bit. It was kind of a asymmetric defensive line. So we have a central defender stopper here who will move forward into this space to try to stop attacks from this side. We have a covering center defender who will look to cover into the space behind. And then we have an inverted fullback who will naturally tuck in as well. So this should kind of emulate what that defensive line looked like. And then, of course, we have the defensive winger who will drop in as well. We have two defensive mids here, a halfback who can also shuttle into this space. Then we have the inside forward on support. They'll drop into this space, our advanced playmaker on support who will try to roam these areas and create something for an advanced forward on attack. This was, of course, a defensive mentality, so we have it as such. Then we have kind of the usual Catenaccio style, looking to counterattack. So weirdly more direct passing, but a lower tempo. I don't really know why this is the thing for Catenaccio, but apparently this is how Football Manager likes it. Definitely a more narrow attack. It is a defensive formation, so a little bit more time wasting. They are looking to counter, but regroup defensively. And then finally, a low block and a low defensive line. And again, in real life, this is actually a tactic that I think would work well, especially if you had a really good complete wingback on the left. I actually think this is something that could work. It's just in a Football Manager, low lines in a defensive style. I don't think it's going to work in game. Purvis Estupiñán should be the player that plays in that left back role, and I'm really curious to see how he does because he is a phenomenal player in game, and I'm curious to see if this tactic will get the most out of him. All right, let's see how this tactic works. Ah, man. Brighton have finished in 19th. 5 wins, 8 draws, 25 losses, and only 23 points. Weirdly, this is one that I wanted to work. I just don't know how to make it work in Football Manager. Sorting by goals scored, that right there is one of the big issues. There just aren't many goals in Football Manager in this formation. And because of the way FM works, you end up being kind of overwhelmed defensively, leading to a lot of goals allowed. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the tactic in game, it had the highest expected goals allowed, despite being a defensive tactic. Expected goals for was also the second lowest in the league. And this tactic did not get the most out of Purvis Estupiñán, even though he played most of the games this season, 1 goal and 4 assists. We did not replicate that success that Facchetti had previously. I do think there is actually a way to make this tactic work, but I think you'd have to deviate from a true Catenaccio style. You definitely want to go into a more positive formation and move the lines up. I think if you did that, the roles here kind of work together, and I think it would work. But you just need to move away from maybe the defensive style and move the lines up as well. All right, let's move on to the next one. Moving into the 1970s, a football revolution was occurring. Total football. A philosophy built around all outfield players being able to take over any other role in the team. Wingbacks would push higher up the pitch, wingers would tuck inside, center mids could cover wide, forwards could drop into the midfield. But most interestingly, this led to the invention of the libero, a center back who could play up in midfield, and then the center mid could drop in accordingly. Total football is most synonymous with Johan Cruyff, and this style of play continues to influence footballing tactics today. This right here, of all the historical tactics, this one is my favorite. We have a kind of older version of a 4-3-3 with 4 defenders, 3 classic center mids, and 3 attacking players. Just in like those early Netherlands side, we have 2 wingbacks on support who are looking to get higher up the pitch. We have ball playing defender and a libero. The libero will look to step up into the midfield. In the center mid positions, we have two carrileros. The reason for that being is that they're going to be able to shuttle into the wide areas, and a deep lying playmaker on defend who will go into this area with the libero here, and they'll be kind of able to interchange in this position. Then up top, inside forward on support, inside forward on attack, they'll be looking to get more inside as the wingbacks look to support them on the outside. And then we have a false nine, a player who will look to drop into this space here. I think this is a really, really fun tactic. This is my favorite of all of them. Looking at the player instructions, we have a positive mentality. This is the one where we are definitely looking to move forward, definitely looking to play out of defense. It is a more shorter passing style, but a much higher tempo, and one that allows them to be a little bit more expressive. Looking here, we're definitely looking to play out of the back, counter press and counter. Counter pressing was definitely a feature of those total football sides, and we are looking to play much higher up the pitch. I think this tactic is going to work really well and be really fun. Let's see how it does. And this one is fun. This is a tactic that works in Football Manager. Brighton have finished in 7th place, overachieving, finishing in the top half, and just narrowly missing out on the European places. And actually, it could have been a lot better for Brighton. It looks like we suffered from the usual around Christmas time when other teams start to figure it out, but a really good start to the season for Brighton, as high as 3rd and 4th place in the top 4 for a few weeks of the season. A really solid expected goals for in this formation. 8th for expected goals for in the top half, so a really solid attacking tactic. And honestly, not bad defensively here. Expected goals against, Brighton were the 4th best team defensively. Overall, I think the only feature that, if you wanted it to be more like total football, so to speak, is maybe the possession statistic. If you had a better team, a Man City, an Arsenal, a United, I think the possession statistics might be higher. But 53% average possession is pretty solid. More often than not, Brighton having the ball more often than the other team. If you wanted even more possession, you could definitely lower the tempo a little bit. That would give you a lot more possession. But I think the tactic works with a higher tempo, and I like what we've seen here. This was a fun tactic. I think it was really successful. A 7th place finish is very solid. Let's move into the next one. Moving into the 1990s, English football was dominated by the 4-4-2. It was a direct tactic with overlapping fullbacks, wingers who would hug the touchline and look to get crosses into the box for forwards, who would often interlink and cross over with each other. Sir Alex Ferguson's treble-winning side were perhaps the most famous employers of the 4-4-2, with Ryan Giggs and David Beckham as wingers, and Andrew Cole and Dwight York as interlinking forwards. Those Sir Alex Ferguson sides of the 1990s were some of the most exciting teams to watch, but they played a very simple 4-4-2 formation, and this is exactly kind of what it looked like. 2 central defenders, nothing special about them. 2 fullbacks on support who will be looking to get forward and overlap. 2 wingers on attack who are looking to run past their defender and get crosses in. In the middle, box-to-box midfielder on support. You could also make this maybe a ball-winning midfielder, but I think Roy Keane was more known as a box-to-box, definitely getting into the opposition area. You can also do an advanced playmaker or a deep-lying playmaker here. I like an advanced playmaker, but if you wanted a deep-lying playmaker to connect with the back line, you could absolutely do that. And then an advanced forward and a deep-lying forward. When you incorporate this style in Football Manager, it actually tells you to go balanced. So I'm going with it because this is what Football Manager recommends. However, if I were doing this personally, I would probably do this with a more positive or even attacking tactic. They're definitely playing wide, wingers who are definitely going to hug the touchline. We have overlaps and focus play down the wings, passing into space, getting into the channels. Slightly more direct passing and a slightly higher tempo for certain. Interestingly, we're going to distribute to the flanks and counter. No counter press at this stage, though. Counter pressing wasn't really a huge aspect of what was going on in the 90s. So no counter pressing, just countering. And then teams definitely seem to play a mid-block more often around this time. I think if I were employing this to be a really good tactic in Football Manager, I would want to go with a higher line and a higher defensive line. But we're trying to be more true to form here. And what better tactic for the English Premier Division than a classic 4-4-2? Let's see how it does. This worked about exactly as I expected it to. Brighton finishing in 14th, 12 wins, 6 draws, 20 losses, and 42 points. Interestingly, they scored a lot of goals this season, 75 goals. It's just that they also allowed the most goals in the league with 95. The attacking nature of the tactic is definitely reflected in the expected goals for, Brighton having the 5th highest expected goals for in the league, but also the highest expected goals against in the league. One of the most common formations in Football Manager is the 4-3-3, so I wonder if it's just easy to go through the midfield, especially when the team is playing so wide. Maybe if you wanted this to be a little bit better, you could change this to a deep lying playmaker on defend, and maybe move the attacking width a little bit more to fairly wide. Obviously, this isn't the defensive side of things, but when you're playing so wide and you lose the ball, it does mean that there's a lot of room for them to have to cover on a turnover, especially in the middle of the park. So maybe moving to a little bit narrower, even on the attacking side of things, and maybe a deep lying playmaker on defend here would help this tactic out a little bit. Finally, we move into the 2010s, and perhaps no tactical style was as famous during this time as tiki-taka. Inspired by Cruyff's Total Football, Barcelona's 2011 Champions League winning side, managed by Pep Guardiola, are perhaps one of the greatest footballing sides ever. They were built on a shorter passing style, leading to loads of possession, and on the off chance they did lose the ball, they were a relentless pressing side able to win the ball back quickly. And finally, the most modern tactic of all, essentially a 4-3-3 with, I think, a lot of similarities to Total Football, but we are replicating it for how that Barcelona 2011 team played. And that Barcelona 2011 team might play differently than you remember. Definitely two ball playing defenders in the middle who will look to play out of the back. But they had Dani Alves on the right who really liked to bomb up and down. So we're going to play this side as a complete wingback on attack. And then on the left, they had Eric Abidal. Later on, they would have Jordi Alba, who also played more like a wingback. But at this time, they were playing Abidal, who was definitely on the left-hand side and a little bit more defensive. So we're going to play him as a fullback on support. Where I struggled the most with this was perhaps the midfielders. Deep lying playmaker on defend or halfback for Busquets, but I feel like at this time he was a pivot, but not necessarily moving into this position. And he was definitely a holding player. So I'm playing him as a deep lying playmaker on defend because I feel like this is more closer to what he did than a halfback. A halfback would drop into this space, but he wasn't necessarily splitting the center backs at this time. He was more of a pivot and a holding player in the center, hence the deep lying playmaker on defend role. These ones here, though, I really struggled with. Xavi and Iniesta were such brilliant players, and they could have been a lot of things. They weren't deep lying playmakers or I think true box to box midfielders. I didn't want to have two advanced playmakers in there. And the other thing that I think maybe could have been a roaming playmaker, but as a central midfielder on support, if we read the instructions here, central midfielder is responsible for providing industrious and versatile link between the defense and attack, performing a variety of tasks across the center of the pitch. And that's kind of what Iniesta did in this role. He would dribble, he would connect the attack with the defense, he would pass, he could play the through ball. He did a little bit of everything. So I think maybe a central mid on support is the most versatile of our options to capture what Iniesta did. And then I definitely wanted a playmaker in there, so I'm putting Xavi as more of an advanced playmaker in this space. Then up top in these positions here, inside forward on attack and inside forward on support for what Villa and Pedro were doing. And then we have what Messi would have been up top. I'm putting him as more of a deep lying forward on attack. He definitely was an advanced forward because he would go into these places a little bit more, but he still played high and still played to get in behind. So I think he was a little bit more than a false nine. So we're going to play him as a deep lying forward on attack. Looking at our instructions here, definitely a positive tactic. Shorter passing directness, but with a higher tempo. The tempo, I think, is something you can't really capture as well in Football Manager because those Barcelona teams would play slow, so slow, and then suddenly they would increase the tempo and play quickly. They were really good at changing the tempo in matches, but to capture maybe them at their best, we're going to go with a little bit higher tempo. they would pass the ball around, so definitely dribble less, definitely working the ball into the box, and definitely playing out of defense. Moving into transition, definitely distributing center backs to help them play out of the back, definitely distributing quickly. When possession has been won, definitely holding shape. At that point, they'd kind of move into their shape and pass and probe to look at openings, but absolutely counter pressing. This team was a relentless pressing side. And finally, out of possession, Barcelona played high up the pitch. High line of engagement, much higher defensive line, definitely triggering that press much more often, getting stuck in and stepping up more. This team would relentlessly press to get the ball back. Interestingly, my hypothesis is this tactic isn't actually going to work this well. I think this tactic works for great sides. If you put this with a Man City or a Liverpool, I think they'd do really well. But for a mid-table side, I think it's going to be pretty average. Brighton should do well against the teams that they are better than, but I think they'll struggle against teams that they're worse in. Let's see how it looks. Well, Brighton finished 10th, 15 wins, 10 draws, 13 losses, and 55 points. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. Looking at their schedule, an impressive away win against Chelsea, but yeah, it's that like 5-1 loss to Man City. Those are the things you're kind of expecting. 3-0 loss away to United, 2-1 win over Liverpool at home, but then beating Wolves 5-2, definitely overwhelming them there. A bit of a rush patch in December. Maybe that high intensity tactic gets a little bit difficult with all the matches that were coming in, but a really phenomenal run to end the season. Wow. Brighton were actually pretty mid for the whole season, though. Definitely got better towards the end of the season, but overall, pretty solid mid-table side throughout. Unsurprisingly, with the style of football being played, a very good possession-based tactic. 58% possession for a team like Brighton is a lot. A very solid possession tactic. Interestingly, though, expected goals for really low. 15th in expected goals for. I'm kind of surprised to see that. Looking at expected goals against, though, pretty solid. Brighton were a very good defensive side throughout the season. So not a whole lot of goals, but not a whole lot of goals allowed either. Well, those are all the tactics. Some that didn't work so well, but some that actually worked quite well. My favorite, though, definitely total football. I think that still works well in today's game. And I think that is a tactic that you could definitely implement in Football Manager. It kind of takes advantage of the meta as well. But thank you for watching. There are definitely other tactics in the past 100 years that we could look at. So if there's any that you might be interested in, let me know and we could do a part 2 of this. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you are doing well and taking care of yourselves, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!